Well, thanks for coming. We're very excited to be holding this event today. My name is Matt Burrows. For those who don't know me, I'm Director of the Strategic Foresight Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And this session really grew out of the tech forum that we held last December. And we had Mariana, who you're going to hear more from, talk about her book and about the idea of the entrepreneurial state. We had a lot of very good feedback from that session, and obviously in the media there's been a lot of back and forth on this idea of the entrepreneurial state. We highlighted in the report that we did our concerns about the cutbacks in U.S. government funding for DARPA, for NIH, for NSF, I think, which goes along with one of the messages in Mariana's book. That is a continuing concern for us about the competitiveness issue for the U.S. on technology and science. So this is part of an ongoing series that will be looking at that aspect, particularly as technology figures very highly in our foresight agenda. So besides looking at the very different technologies, also looking at this competitiveness issue. So I want to turn it over to Tom Kalil, who's the Deputy Director for Technology and Innovation at the Office of Science and Technology at the White House. He'll give some introductory remarks, and then we'll move on to Mariana, who will give the keynote, and then we'll have some panel discussions after that. So, Tom?
Good morning. Is everyone fired up and ready to go? Is everyone fully caffeinated? Okay. So I thought I would do what I would do in the 3 hours that the organizers have graciously given me is to talk about some of the questions that those of us in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy and the National Economic Council are wrestling with respect to the topic of today's session on the entrepreneurial state. Tell you very briefly what some of the answers that we've come up with, and then invite you to drop me a note if you have other answers to the questions that I'm posing, or have other ideas for questions that we should be asking ourselves in the world. So the one area of focus, which I know our keynote speaker is going to address, are what are the most important steps that the public and private sectors can take to promote high-growth entrepreneurship. And there, the administration has had an initiative called Startup America, which is all about encouraging and promoting high-growth entrepreneurship. And one of the most significant things that we've done working with Congress is to pass legislation that's going to make it easier for companies to raise capital by creating a IPO on-ramp for emerging growth companies, to increase the size of so-called mini public offerings from 5 million to 50 million, and to create a legal framework for equity-based crowdfunding. We also have an effort that is led by the private sector called the Startup America Partnership, which is trying to improve the environment for startups not only in Northern California and Cambridge, Massachusetts, but all over the country. A second question that we're looking at is what are the areas of research that could lead to what economists call general purpose technologies. That is, technologies that are going to have a really large impact on our economy and our society, as opposed to leading to a particular product. And some of the areas where we have multi-agency national research initiatives include big data. How do we go from data to knowledge to action? Cyber physical systems, the convergence of the digital world and the physical world. Robotics, the area of engineering biological systems, and advanced manufacturing, where the president has called for a national network for manufacturing innovation and just announced a series of new manufacturing innovation institutes in areas like modern lightweight metals and digital manufacturing. And he's calling on Congress to pass legislation, but in the interim, agencies like the Department of Defense, Department of Energy, and other agencies are using existing resources to move forward with this. A third question is, how do we improve the commercialization of federally funded research? And one of the most exciting programs that we're working on scaling was started by the National Science Foundation called the I-Corps program. And it is preparing scientists and engineers at both the faculty, graduate student, and postdoc level to apply the scientific method to the startup process. So, typically we think of the way that startups happen is that someone comes up with an idea, they develop a business plan, and they go pitch an angel or venture investor. And what the I-Corps curriculum, which is called the Lean Launchpad curriculum, does is it asks the scientists and engineers to get out of the building and talk to 100 potential customers. So what they usually discover from that process is that their original hypothesis about product market fit, who their potential customers are, channel, pricing, potential partners, was totally off base, and that they have to significantly revise their initial set of hypotheses about what their business plan was going to be based on contact with potential customers. And so the scientists and engineers that are going through this program are doing much better in terms of the ability to get early seed stage funding than scientists and engineers who have not. So that's something that we're excited about, and now working with other agencies outside of the National Science Foundation to scale up the program. The fourth question is, how can policymakers act in ways that reflect Joy's Law? I'm sure you've all heard of Moore's Law. Does anyone know what Joy's Law is? Yep. So what's Joy's Law?
Most of the smartest people don't work for you.
That's right.
The smartest people aren't in the United States.
Right. So again, working with Congress in 2010 as part of the reauthorization of the America Competes bill, we were able to pass legislation that enables all agencies to support incentive prizes for up to $50 million, which is something that the British government did to accelerate the development of longitude in the 1700s. So this is an old idea whose time has come again. And incentive prizes have a number of advantages relative to traditional grants and contracts. The government can set a goal while being agnostic about which team or approach is most likely to be successful, and the government only has to pay if someone is successful. Charles Lindbergh did the first transatlantic flight in response to a $25,000 prize from a New York hotel owner, and he definitely would not have made it through the peer review process because he had a very unconventional engine design, and right up to the day he was successful, everyone thought he was crazy. So the federal government has now supported over 300 of these incentive prizes. Some have had a really big impact, like the earlier DARPA support for the incentive prize around the self-driving car. Larry Page was in the audience at the finish line and hired the winning team from Stanford, which served as the basis for their effort in the area of self-driving cars. And it's part of a broader family of mechanisms that economists like Michael Kramer call pull mechanisms, where the government or the sponsor is trying to pull innovation as opposed to push it. And so this has also been used in the area of vaccines for diseases of the poor. Left to their own devices, pharmaceutical companies will not work on vaccines for poor people. So to address this market failure, 5 countries and the Gates Foundation went to pharma companies and said, if you develop a vaccine which is safe and effective, we will purchase X million doses at $7 a dose, and that intervention will save the lives of 7 million poor kids over the next 20 years. So this idea of the government trying to purchase outcomes as opposed to paying for inputs is a powerful approach that I believe that we're underutilizing. Another question that we're grappling with is how do we inspire more young boys and girls to get interested in the so-called STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering, and math. So one of the things that the president has done is to say, well, if you win the Super Bowl or the NCAA, you get to come to the White House. The same thing should be true if you win a science fair or robotics fair. Later this year, the White House will also be holding the first ever Maker Faire. How many people in the audience have been to a Maker Faire? So the one in Northern California has 120,000 people showing up. The one in the New York Hall of Science, over 60,000. One of the things that we're seeing that the Atlantic Council has written about is the dramatically expanded access to the tools that are necessary to design and make just about anything. And that's going to have relevance not only for STEM, but also for entrepreneurship. So in the same way that cloud computing and open source software have lowered the costs of launching an IT startup, democratization of the tools of the Industrial Revolution can play the same thing in the same similar role in the area of manufacturing. Another question that we ask is, are there systemic gaps in the nation's research and innovation portfolio? So one good example of this is that there are a lot of areas that are really important for society, but the relevant mission agency has little or no capacity to support research and innovation. So we have a $30 billion NIH that invests in biomedical research. The Department of Defense makes a very large investment in research and development. DARPA has the ability to quickly mobilize the best and brightest to work on hard national security problems. But we have little or no capacity to invest in game-changing research that has the potential to transform teaching and learning, because the Department of Education has very little capacity in that area. So that is something that the administration is trying to address, but we're still very far from where we should be. And finally, another question that the administration is asking itself and the outside world is, what are the moonshots of the 21st century? So in the same way that President Kennedy said, let's put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, and we decided to sequence the human genome and drive the cost down from 100 million per human genome to 1,000. What today are the big, hairy, audacious goals that will drive science and technology and inspire the public and solve an important economic or societal problem? So last year, for example, the president unveiled the BRAIN Initiative, a collaboration between NIH, DARPA, the National Science Foundation, and a number of leading foundations and private research organizations that is aimed at dramatically improving our understanding of how the brain works. So we'll expand the frontiers of human knowledge about how do trillions of neurons work together to produce memory and vision and action and consciousness and all the other groovy things that the human brain does. It will inspire a new generation of computer architectures called neuromorphic computing, which will be much more energy efficient than today's computing. And in the long term, it could lead to improvements in our ability to diagnose, treat, prevent, and cure diseases of the brain, which as the population ages are going to become more and more expensive. Other grand challenges that the administration is embracing in the Department of Energy, one called Sunshot, where the goal is to make solar as cheap as coal by the end of the decade, EV everywhere, to make an electric vehicle as convenient and affordable to own as a gas-powered vehicle. But we also see the private sector embracing some really audacious goals. IBM driving advances in cognitive computing by beating Garry Kasparov at chess and Ken Jennings at Jeopardy. Qualcomm supporting a large incentive prize for a tricorder, a handheld device that could diagnose dozens of diseases as accurately as a board-certified physician. And Elon Musk, the CEO of SpaceX, stating, "I want to die on Mars, but not on impact." So his modest goal is to make humanity a multi-planetary species. So the reason I think this is so important is that as these technologies, information technology, advanced materials, nanoscience, biological engineering, become increasingly sophisticated and powerful, I think a lot of the most important questions shift from what can we do to what should we do, which are ethical and moral and normative questions, not just questions that should be left to scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs. So I'm really looking forward to the remarks of our keynote speaker. And if you have other ideas for the questions that I posed or new questions that I should be asking, drop me a note. My email is tkhalil@ostp.eop.gov. Thank you very much.
Okay, now we want to turn to the keynote, so I want to introduce Mariana Mazzucato, who is the R.M. Phillips Professor in Economics of Innovation, Science and Technology Policy Research Center at the University of Sussex. It's a great pleasure to have you back, and we're really very looking forward to your keynote address to us. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks especially to Banning, who, I don't know if you know, sort of mustered this whole thing together. And 2 days ago, I gave a talk at ARPA-E, which did their annual innovation summit. I had about 40 slides, and people, liked the talk, but I could tell that they were getting dizzy, so I decided to do no slides today, even though there's lots of really interesting numbers that I want to talk to you about. In terms of the trends. So if you start seeing me kind of go like that, just ignore it and just look at me. And one of my ambitions is actually to take the whole innovation, let's just call it discourse, strategy, policy, out of its comfort zone. Because to be honest, there was plenty of innovation in the 1990s. We haven't really had a lack of innovation. We also didn't really have a lack of growth, What we've had a lack of, I think, is a type of growth that is both innovation-led, let's call it smart growth. This is the lingo that they use in the European Commission, where I work quite a bit with policymakers up there. Smart growth that is also inclusive growth and sustainable growth. And I really think that's the challenge. And to talk about that, and to talk about the specifics about how that could happen, to be honest, does start to take us out of the comfort zone. And so on the one hand, I was just saying this before to Tom, but Tom's like, oh, but please don't get us out of the comfort zone, because we actually need agreement, in Washington, and it's nice when people, agree. But, of course that's true. We want the whole bipartisanship. However, there's lots of, if you want, sickness right now in the real economy. It's not true that the only kind of rebalancing that's needed is away from big bad finance, the hedge funds, the credit default swaps, the derivatives, towards this sort of rosy, real industry, the makers. The real economy is just as sick as finance. And so that as well, I think, should be at the heart of innovation and industrial policy, how to, if you want, definancialize the real economy. Anyway, so to sort of present some sort of logical, thread on the discussion, I really want to focus on 4 points. And some of this is background, but the background's really important, which is, what kind of framework do economists even have to talk about this stuff, right? So again, I was at ARPA-E's summit, and an agency like ARPA-E or DARPA or even NIH, to be completely honest, it's very hard to understand what they're doing as an economist. Why? Because in economics, we assume that the role of the public sector, and if I use the word state and the public sector, just remember that I'm not talking about kind of Big Brother, right? I'm talking about this decentralized network of state agencies, which in places like the US have been very active in innovation, which I'll talk about later. Anyway, but to be quick, I'll just say state or public sector. We have an idea that the only time that the public sector should actually sort of intervene, the state should intervene, is, well, some people think it shouldn't intervene, right? It should just get out of the way, just create the conditions. But the main point is that it should intervene when you have market failures, right? So market failure, typical market failure, in fact, is basic research, because it's extremely hard to appropriate. It's a public good, so there's underinvestment in that area. right? And there's very little disagreement on that. Okay, so again, I speak like an American even though I'm Italian because my father does nuclear fusion at Princeton. We left Italy when I was 5 to go there, and no one disagrees that it should be the US government or whatever government around the world funding that kind of basic, kind of big blue sky stuff. However, the problem is that when you actually look at those countries, like the US, or regions within countries like Silicon Valley, that have actually achieved this smart, innovation-led growth, what these different types of state public agencies have done has gone way beyond fixing the public good problem. And my slide that I usually show shows the whole innovation chain from the really upstream basic research down to the applied stuff and down to the startup funding. And what you find in, again, the successful places, which I would include Israel, the US, Finland, Denmark, Germany, increasingly China, is actually having a very active, visible, not invisible hand along that entire chain. And both in terms of the breadth, but also the depth, okay? And when you start looking at the depth, I mean, the numbers you just mentioned around NIH, it's 31.2, I think, billion a year that they're spending. That's a lot of money. And it's not just the basic research. A controversial book called The Truth Behind the Drug Companies by Marcia Angel, she was the ex-editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, argues that that money over the last 10 years, which I think amounts to almost 800 billion, has actually been responsible for the most revolutionary new drugs, which are these priority-rated new molecular entities. Okay, so this, money has actually produced lots of very concrete drugs, not just the basic research, and it's the most revolutionary drugs. And that word is quite important, too, because I usually have up there also a wonderful slide by The Economist in the special issue they recently did on the new industrial revolution, where they were talking about advances in nanotech as well as clean tech, and they were very explicit, and I think this really sort of represents how economists also think, which is, they said, what the state needs to do for the new industrial revolution, this kind of, exciting new time we're living under, is fund the basics, right? So what are the basics? Basic research, education, infrastructure, and skills, and leave the rest to the revolutionaries. It was, very explicit. And I think that even though that was sort of a dramatic way, which the Economist editorials often speak, it's very representative also of how economic theory approaches it, which is always this assumption that the creativity, the dynamism, the fun, funky stuff, the stay hungry, stay foolish, stuff that Steve Jobs talked about, is always in the private sector. So at best, what the public sector should do is create the conditions. But again, if you then look at what happened in the nanotech revolution, the biotech revolution, the IT revolution, and what I'll talk about later, the clean tech revolution that we're starting to witness today, has actually been different types of state agencies around the world that have actually been able to think up crazy stuff, right? I mean, nanotech is the best example, where the word itself came out of, what do you call it? Do you use the word civil sector workers here? No. Anyway, service, what do you call government workers then? Civil servants, out of the NSF, and then later out of this National Nanotech Initiative. It wasn't that you had business that wanted to do it and then just needed help putting patches here and there. The vision, the mission itself came from these sort of state agencies. So the key word here is mission, which you used as well, right? So you have a market failure framework, which is all based on sort of putting little patches here and there. There's another framework, which myself and others are developing, which is really called the mission-oriented framework. And frameworks matter because it's not just about describing what happened, saying, it wasn't just putting patches. It was actually kind of thinking big, from putting a man on the moon or woman on the moon to solving climate change today and all sorts of other big societal challenges. It's not just that. It also, if you have a different framework, does then come down to different indicators of performance, how you then judge those investments. And if I have time, I'll talk a bit about at the end on how lots of these agencies around the world, for example, the China Development Bank or the Brazilian Development Bank that I work with in different spaces, then get accused of crowding out. Or even when they're allowed to be talked about in terms of crowding in, that way of talking about the performance, because that in the end ends up being an indicator of what they're actually doing, of how to judge it, and then to decide whether they should keep on investing or not, comes from the framework. So if you really have a different framework from the market failure framework, the question then becomes, how does that then trickle down to a different way to actually analyze whether these agencies are doing sort of good or bad? Are they crowding out private finance, or are they actually completely changing the landscape? And if they are changing that landscape, how do we talk about that in economics? How do we actually include that, vision, the mission in our econometric models? And if we can't, that's a problem. Right, the second point is, the reason that I call the book The Entrepreneurial State is, to me, entrepreneurship is not just about setting up a company. It's actually about sort of the ability and willingness to really take on, fundamental uncertainty, which of course is different from risk, right? Risk, you can actually do a probability distribution on it, your probability of winning the lottery. Uncertainty is more the probability of your wife or husband divorcing you. It's much harder to do a probability on that, or war outcomes, but innovation is definitely an example of real uncertainty. And if you think of it as, again, this is the problem of not having these slides, capital intensity on the vertical axis and technological and market risk on the horizontal, and put that into 4 quadrants, that upper right-hand quadrant is often starved of private finance. Okay, and what you often see when the state has, in fact, played this mission-oriented role has been really occupying that upper right-hand quadrant of high capital intensity and high technological and market risk. And what does that mean? You're often going to screw up, right? I mean, the probability of failure, again, even though I'm using the word probability, is extremely high. For every Tesla Motors, right, which Obama successfully backed with a $500 million guaranteed loan, you'll have 9 Solyndras. The problem is that unless we have a framework, again, to talk about this, we only end up hearing about the Solyndras. Very few people out there know that also Tesla Motors got that money. But the point is that whereas we know this with VC, with venture capital money, same kind of probability of failure, 8 out of 10 investments fail. The difference with VC is that that one winning investment, Kleiner Perkins, when invested in Genentech, more than covers the losses and also brings back the money for the next round. Again, a point I'll come to later. But anyway, the point is high risk, lots of uncertainty. By that, that's why I call it the entrepreneurial state, because those few places, I'm from Italy, the Italian state does not play this role. So I'm talking about the few places where we have had smart innovation-led growth, you have had an entrepreneurial state willing to really engage with that uncertainty, but also to bring the kind of expertise within public agencies to deal with that. I mean, the fact that there was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist that up until recently was directing the DOE, how cool is that, right? I mean, the sort of vision, the dynamism, the mission-orientedness really then translates to also setting up these dynamic state agencies which create these teams. In ARPA-E, this great book recently called, what was it called? The New Deal by Michael Grunwald, at one point says, you walk into ARPA-E and it kind of feels like Google. And that's good, because coming back to your point about getting, kids to study STEM, another thing we want people to do is to go, some of the smartest and brightest to go work within public sector institutions. And it's going to be very hard to do that if you only describe the state as administering, right? Solving little market failures. Another great book, marketing everyone else's book but mine. Tony Judd's Ill Fares the Land. He passed away recently. It's a wonderful book, because what he says is that we have a discursive battle. We have a battle with how we talk about the state. And he says at one point, even though it's just a sentence in the book, but it completely resounded to me because I was thinking about those kind of issues. He said, at some point in the 1970s, this word administration pops up, right? How boring is that, to talk about the government as simply administering? And he basically argues quite forcefully that there's been this coevolution of sort of, let's just call it, state bashing, or the retraction of the state from being an active player, with the language that we're actually using to describe it. And again, so I think that is part of the whole mission-oriented agenda, also to change the language, but then as an economist, coming back to the point before, I think it should also change then the indicators. Third point is, we live, as I was sort of mentioning in the beginning, in a world that's quite problematic in terms of the degree to which the real economy, and by that I mean the industries that are, the makers, both products and services, is financialized. And so what this means is that even if over time, sort of like the last 80 years, we have had in the US quite an active state doing things like, I didn't mention my usual thing, but the government, basically invested in all the things that make the iPhone smart, right? Why can your iPhone do what it can, surf the web, know where it's going, GPS, the touchscreen display, the Siri voice-activated system, it's all state-funded, right? So even though that has been actually a stable attribute of the US economy over the last 70 years, something that's new is actually that the state has had to increase its role. If you look at the NIH money, if you look at even the SBIR funds, why? Because the private sector, both private finance, but also lots of big private companies have retracted from the real economy, from actually nurturing the productive economy. We don't have today the Xerox Parks and the Bell Labs that really are working alongside the state in symbiotic public-private partnerships. Cisco, this is where I start getting these faces like this, because half the time there's someone at Cisco in the audience, or Pfizer or Amgen, because these are the numbers that are in my head, because I've actually looked at the numbers over time, and they're scary, and this is where my graphs would be extremely useful right now, which is that since 2000, it really is actually striking. It's, end of 1990s, early 2000s is when the numbers just go skyrocketing. The amount of money that these large companies are spending on share buybacks is extraordinary. Okay, so the numbers for the Fortune 500 for the last 10 years is $3 trillion. But most of these companies, and I will name them, and it's not to name and shame, but it's actually to encourage, a change of the way we talk about these public-private partnerships. But lead companies in IT, in pharma, and unfortunately, in the whole clean tech energy business, are spending about, anyway, there's no point in actually talking about the companies, but on average, something like 115 to 130% of what they're spending on R&D on share buybacks. Then you ask the companies, why are you doing that? Why aren't you spending on R&D and human capital formation in terms of reinvestment of your profits? And they say, well, there's no opportunities for investment today. And then you look at the highest share buybackers, and this is, in fact, in the health and oil, and there's no opportunities in health, there's no opportunities in oil, in renewable energy, you must be joking. And so then you start looking around the world at who is spending big time. I'm not talking about, the easy spaces, but in that upper right-hand quadrant that I was talking about before, the high capital intensive and high technological market risk in the clean tech space. Well, Bloomberg New Energy Finance is a wonderful database to ask that question. And 2012, if you add up all the private money in the world, okay, so private equity, venture capital, stock market, and corporate money in renewable energy, it came to $12.5 billion. Just take the top state investment banks. So it's China Development Bank, which is the biggest player, the Brazilian Development Bank, an emerging middle-income country, very big player, KfW, the German investment bank, and the EIB, the European Investment Bank, 80 billion. And so this is very interesting because it's not just the point of, yes, you have market failures, so the government has to come in. It's not just the point about mission-orientedness that actually over time the government did even more than just solve market failures. It's also that in an increasingly financialized world where private finance has retreated, okay, different types of public finance, and that example there was just about development banks, have actually had to step up. Okay, and it's not all development banks. Again, in Italy, we have the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti, and ain't doing nothing. But those vision, mission-oriented governments, like today the Brazilian government, which is very explicit about innovation and poverty alleviation, trying to do that. Merkel's government, which said we want to completely denuclearize. And again, a great graph I usually have is just how much money since 2007 they've been spending post-crisis on renewable energy. It's just exponential increases. But the problem is also that venture capital itself, private VC, has become increasingly short-termist, which has become a huge problem in industries like, say, biotechnology, when all the emphasis is on the exit, right? And when you want those returns in 3 to 5 years, in an innovation space like clean tech, biotech, or nanotech, which actually things take 15 to 20 years, you can really screw things up. Because there's a feedback between finance and innovation. It's not just that different types of companies require different types of finance. We know lots about that, right? Myself and others have written a lot about how different types of companies require different types of finance. The point is also that what kind of finance is actually received and the attributes and the characteristics of that finance actually then affect the innovation and investment process. And what we see in biotech are all these PLEPOs, right? Productless IPOs. Because the finance structure that has actually been funneling money into biotech has been quite problematic and is just focused on the IPO in 3 to 5 years. And it's a problem. But also, it's become increasingly short-termist. Why? Because the narrative, coming back to Tony Jutt's points, the discourse about innovation has been completely captured by that whole kind of VC, startup, Silicon Valley cool stuff. And so the degree to which they've been actually able to lobby for pretty problematic policies, in the UK, it was Labour, the Progressive Labour Party under Gordon Brown that actually, well, when he was in charge of the Treasury, which reduced the time that private equity has to be invested from 10 years to 2 years to be eligible for huge tax reductions. What does that do? It makes venture capital, which in the UK is actually not even differentiated from private equity in terms of tax treatment, even more short-termist. But how did that happen? Through a discourse of who the sort of key entrepreneurs and innovators were. But also in the US, I was mentioning before, capital gains tax in 1976 came down to, the National Venture Capital Association, which actually formed in 1976, started to really lobby government to reduce capital gains tax. It was successful. In 1981, it went down from 40% to 20%, and since then has been coming down, and also the details around it in terms of, again, how long it has to be invested through, again, a narrative. We are the entrepreneurs, we are the innovators. If you want the whole kind of Silicon Valley thing, this is what you're going to have to do. But there's no evidence at all that any of those policies actually increase anything but inequality. Even things like R&D tax credits, to be honest, there's very few studies that show additionality. So by additionality, I mean making R&D happen that would not have happened anyway. Because what really drives the big R&D are these perceptions of where the future technological and market opportunities are. Okay, Keynes used the word animal spirits because what he meant was, that the reason that we need government to come in and, stabilize the economy is that the I part of GDP, right? So you have C plus I plus G plus X minus M, GDP, consumption, private investment, government spending, and net exports. He said the I part, and you can just get an Excel sheet and you'll see this, is not only completely pro-cyclical, so too much during the boom, too little during the bust, so you need counter-cyclical government, which unfortunately we don't have around the world today. But also it's extremely volatile, always. C is more or less a monotonic function of disposable income. I is like that. Okay, why? Because what's driving it are not these little tweaks in taxes and interest rates, but these perceptions, these gut instincts, these animal spirits. And what we know from the studies that people like myself do in industry dynamics is, for example, if you look at entry rates, this is the area of I/O that I work in. It's called industry dynamics. We look at, for example, the correlation between entry rates in different sectors and profits. There's no relationship. Firms that enter a particular sector are not entering because of current profits, but perception about future profits. That's completely different. And what's actually driving these opportunities, we have different indicators, different proxies. One of the key ones is, in fact, how much sort of mission-oriented public finance is going into a particular area. Okay, so when recently GE and Vestas, for example, left the UK, some offshore wind projects, what they said was there's no vision in the UK for green. Okay, there's all sorts of tax credits, but there's no vision. And so that's a big issue. So just to sort of start closing up, because I saw that lots of the tweets that were going around this meeting were all about public-private partnerships, so I started really thinking, what do I want to say about public-private partnerships? First of all, that it's nothing new. We've always had public-private partnerships. The problem is that when we talk about ecosystems of innovation, right, this is another of these trendy words that everyone talks about, the problem is there's different types of ecosystems. You can have symbiotic ecosystems, or you can have parasitic, predator-prey type ecosystems, just from a biological perspective, right? And I think that's where the conversation has to come. And to have a symbiotic public-private partnership, I think there's two key things that we have to start having. Because, everything else we kind of know, of course we want that stuff. Of course we want the apprenticeships. Of course we want more kids in STEM. I'm not saying that the battle's not there. Everything you said is so important, and we have to make it happen. However, I think you'll find little disagreement with the points that you raised. What I think absolutely has to happen in order to make the growth that could potentially then be generated from those kind of investments to be both smart, but also inclusive and also sustainable, is two issues, which is one, definancialize this real economy, actually not just have a life sciences strategy, say, and throw even more money at pharma and biotech, but actually really demand and sit down at the table with the large biotech companies like Amgen and Pfizer and Glaxo, and actually ask them to have a different voice, both in terms of the lobbying that they're asking for. So, this patent box policy that has just been introduced in the UK, that's about to be introduced here as well, I heard, where if you have a patent on an airplane, just a screw is patented on an airplane, the entire income generated from that airplane is susceptible to these massive tax reductions. That's going to do nothing for the investments in innovation, because patents are already a monopoly, right? We've already taken care of that problem. You don't target the income generated from the patent. You have to target the research that actually leads up to it. So those kind of policies, all they're really doing is taking out even more money, if you want, from the state coffers, which we know are very important for funding these future opportunities, which in fact do drive the big pharma investments. Pfizer shut down its plant in Sandwich, Kent, and went to Boston, not because there's lower tax or lower regulation in Boston, but because of this 32 almost billion a year. So to really change that kind of discussion that business has with government, but also to question whether things like share buybacks, that to me are just a proxy for this degree of financialization, we have to transform that. But also this whole risk-reward nexus that I mentioned before. If it's true that for every Tesla you have 9 Cylindras, or for every internet you have 9 Concords, how the hell are you going to cover those losses? And it's very interesting to look at around the world at different ways that this is thought about. So in some countries where there's less of an ideological battle, like in Finland or even in Israel, there's very little issue with things like, why not take some equity? Why not? Why a complete giveaway? And the usual answer is, well, taxes, they already take care of that problem, right? That's the return to government, because the growth that's generated from these companies, the tax that'll then be paid, the spillovers will actually bring back a return. And the answer is that's not true. Both because these companies don't pay much tax. And it's not me saying it, just look at the front page of any big paper today. This is a massive issue. So, Google's algorithm was funded by the NSF. Well, Google pays very little tax, and the NSF today has a big crisis in terms of its budget. Or sort of. And anyway, things are not so easy. Apple, all the technologies that make the iPhone smart funded by government, Apple pays very little tax. Many of the jobs go abroad, right? So why not have something like, and how this is done, one has to think about it, but the conversation's not even there. So I just want to say, let's have that conversation. Why not have an innovation fund or something where these companies that are benefiting so much actually pay into? Or, again, you could either retain equity. This happens in places like Finland, where Sitra, public funding agency that funded Nokia, retained equity and made a lot of money, but then funded new stuff. Income contingent loans, we do it with students, why not with companies? But also retaining some sort of golden share of the IPR. I mean, the Bayh-Dole Act, or how do you pronounce it here? Bayh-Dole Act, sorry. The Bayh-Dole Act was, a good idea, and it worked wonders. It actually created the whole biotech revolution, lots of spin-outs that were coming out of these patents that before could not be patented, right? So the Bayh-Dole Act was an act in 1980 that allowed publicly funded research to be patented. But if you look at that act, it actually says in there, it says, we have to actually be careful, though, that the taxpayer doesn't pay twice, right? You pay for the research, and then you pay for these really high prices for the drugs. Whether it's individually or through your insurance or through the welfare state, you're still paying for it. And so it actually says that government should actually be able to exercise some sort of say on the prices. That's never happened. I think the reason that that conversation also is not there is that there's a complete asymmetry in terms of the power relations, or if you don't like the word power, the way that these things are currently talked about. So this assumption that, again, all the innovation, the crazy, the fun stuff, the dynamism, the innovation is in the private sector and the state is just fixing things, in fact, has hurt the ability of government even to exercise its right, which is written in that act. Anyway, retaining some sort of golden share of the IPR, why not? But anyway, these state investment banks that I've mentioned before that are taking an increasing role in innovation, especially in renewable energy, they do by definition retain equity. So in Brazil, the Brazilian Development Bank in the last 10 years has actually been making something like 21% return on equity, at least the last 3 years. That money goes back to the Treasury, almost all of it. 80% of it does, which then is refunneled into the economy, the schools, the favelas, the education, healthcare system. That is a very specific tool through which you can actually get this smart and inclusive growth, because it's not going to happen on its own. And completely lastly, just to say that it's not just about, again, increasing the role of the public sector, but getting the public sector to really do what it should do, which is not just fixing the public good problem, even though that is a big problem, but also being able to dream and to be crazy. So there's a wonderful quote by Keynes in The End of Laissez-Faire, where he says, the role of government is not just to make things a little bit better or a little bit worse, but to really be doing what's not being done at all. And I think this is another problem, because when you look at what the public sector is doing, for example, in pharmaceuticals or in some other sectors, it's actually often reproducing the existing bias. So for example, in pharma, almost all the research is on drugs, medicines. There's very little on diagnostics, on surgical treatments, on lifestyle. It's a bunch of hippies like us that take vitamins and go running. You have no idea why, because there's no proper research on that. When you have the third sector, Wellcome Trust, CRIC, or your Pew, Charitable Trust, whatever, entering a space, they should, and the state through the NIH, it should often be guided by really transforming a space, really changing what's going on. And part of the, so on the one hand, they're actually doing lots of the revolutionary things within that drug space. This was Marcia Angel's point. But the question is, why just drugs? And I think this has also been a result. By diminishing and talking about the state in this increasingly kind of boring way, we've diminished its ability to really try to be transformative and to really, within energy, for example, really think big. Because, of course, renewal, the whole green revolution is not just going to be about, wind, solar, and biofuels. It's actually going to be about transforming how every sector works, production, distribution, consumption. Because don't forget, and this, I promise this is the last sentence, don't forget that every revolution technologically, say the IT revolution, the electricity revolution, the real problem is the deployment, right? We haven't fully deployed the IT revolution yet. And what green could be, what the green revolution in some ways could be, it's not so much technological, even though there's huge technological challenges, but in some ways those technologies have already existed. It could be a complete redirection of the IT revolution in its deployment phase. And that has always happened. So when we had mass production, the way it got fully deployed throughout the economic system was through things like suburbanization. That was a result of a policy. People didn't just wake up and want to go to the suburbs. That was facilitated through policy. So that's also part of the thinking big. How can we get policies that redirect or direct the way that the whole IT thing really gets fully deployed and make that direction be green? Okay, that's very different from just thinking about funding offshore, onshore, and solar. That's it. What am I supposed to say? I welcome the three guys. Steve Clemons, who else is coming? Dean Baker.
Great.
Who's the third?
Great Alan Wolff.
Oh. Where's
Thank you,
Alan?
Mariana.
Okay.
Wonderful, great, thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. Mariana, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure. I mean, I've been trying to meet Mariana. In fact, I invited her a few weeks ago to speak at a conference that The Atlantic was doing. By the way, I'm Steve Clemons. I'm Washington editor-at-large of The Atlantic. And so I contacted Mariana and I said, you're the hottest, thing I hear. I didn't know, I thought the hottest intellectual, but intellectually raising these issues about the economy, what a healthy economy does, what it looks like. And so I contacted her to speak at a big conference that we're having in a few weeks. Dean, I need to call you that, probably Alan, you as well. And she said, well, I can't make your conference, but why don't you come to my conference and Banning? So it's a real pleasure to be here. There are folks like Hedrick Smith and others in the audience, and so many of you have been in this game for years and thought this through, that I hope we can turn this from presentations into a conference. But we have Dean Baker here. Dean is, of course, a great friend. He's director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research. And of all economists that I know, serious economists, I don't know anyone who's more forthright and sort of brutally candid about the market failure problems of economics. And so I'm interested to sort of see where he goes with this. And then, of course, Ambassador Alan William Wolff, who is a senior counsel at McKenna Long. He's chairman of the board of the National Foreign Trade Council. You have some other major title, Alan, let me just pull it up here, in the co-chair of the U.S. National Academies Innovation Policy Forum. But to also take it to a personal level, Alan is another one who's been thinking about trade, technology, and investment, and really what the role of the state, what the ecosystem is in innovation for a generation. And it does remind me of when I was thinking about these issues in the 1990s. To some degree, when you take the book like Mariana and what she's positing and looking at now, we both have an opportunity to look over the lifetime of your own work at where we were derelict. What didn't we do that we should have done in the past, given the kind of findings and thinking that she's put forward? Because we have the ability today to look back with now hindsight and sort of say, where did we screw up? And then secondly, where did we get things right? And why did we get them right? Because I think fundamentally it's not just coming out with a book like Mariana's and saying, okay, the state matters in these various ways. This has been a really deeply ideological and impassioned debate for a long time, and so I'm looking forward to both of your comments. Let me invite Dean Baker. You're going to speak at the podium for a few minutes, and then invite Alan Wolff to follow you.
It was very cruel to have me speak after Mariana, so I'll try not to be too disappointing. First off, one of the things I really appreciate, I like much of what she said, most of what she said, but one of the things I really appreciate, the discussion about the buybacks, because I remember a little while ago I was debating with someone on Apple's share price, which I don't follow particular stocks in general, but you go, look at the huge share price.
But he does follow real estate.
I do follow real estate. I did follow the stock bubble. I caught that one, but easy enough. But anyhow, so someone was saying, oh, Apple's a great company. They're sitting on all this cash. And I was going, well, I'm not sure that's that good. And there was someone else there who is an expert in finance. He goes, well, when an ideas company is out of ideas, that's really bad sign. So yes, I mean, this is a big problem when our tech innovators, the leading tech innovators, the best thing they could do with their money is pay out money as dividends or share buybacks. Again, I agree, I certainly appreciate Mariana's comments. I think it's very much along the right line. It actually might take it a step further. Maybe she would agree on this, but I think, the conventional view, the government comes in as market failure. So we need basic research. It's like a little patch, we could all agree on that. And then we leave the rest to the private sector. That really has to be blown out of the water. And the way I'll go a step further, and perhaps not, maybe Mariana would agree 100% on this, we have to understand patents are government policy. Okay, it's a government-granted monopoly. Now, I say this, I don't know how many economists I got ready to slug me, because I go, what do you mean? You're saying patents are bad. No, I said they're government policy. So the point is, sometimes they are bad. I mean, absolutely. Sometimes they are really, really bad. I'll say more about that in a second. But the point is, it's a government policy. So if we want to be Joe free market, then let's get rid of the patents. Okay, you can't tell me, patents didn't come to us from God. We create patents. We decide what you can get patented, how long it is, how deep it is. That's government policy. Okay, so it's, and I think this is really important, not just as, speaking to the specific issue, how should we design patents, where should they be, but to understand the world. If you don't understand government patents or patents are government policy, you aren't in this debate. You're an ideologue. That's as simple as it could possibly be. The government will arrest people, and I've had people say, no, they don't arrest people. No, you go to court, you get an injunction, then if you violate the injunction, then you're arrested. So the government arrests people who violate patents. So that is government policy. So I think that's really, really important to understand. Okay, now, taking a step further, drugs are a great place to start. Mariana talked about this. She's written on this. Drugs, I think, are, on the one hand, it's a shining example of, where government research has been very successful. Again, $30 billion a year for NIH that we've been doing for, well, we've had about $30 billion for about a decade, but, we've had substantial funding in NIH for a long time. Across the board, you do not find anyone, conservative Republicans, liberal Democrats, you don't find anyone who doesn't say that's a good investment. Okay, so it's an outstanding example of government investment. Now, what does the biotech, what does the pharmaceutical industry do with that? I would say they do a complete disaster. If you look at the innovative drugs in the last decade, again, the FDA rates them, so it's not, do I think it's a good drug? The FDA rates drug approvals. Every drug is rated as either standard or priority approval. The idea is standard is it basically does what other drugs do. Priority is a breakthrough drug. We've had a big fall off in priority approvals over the last decade, even though the industry claims it's spending more than ever on research. What does that tell us? It's wasting its money. Okay, and then when they do develop a drug, what do? They charge up the wazoo for it. And, again, this should have economists jumping up and down and screaming. If we want to put 20% tariff on my jacket, I know I need a new one. If we want to put 20% tariff on my jacket, we'll have no shortage of economists who will tell us how stupid that is. Okay, it should sell at the, the market price. You have government intervention, raising the price above marginal cost. We can all do the diagrams. It's, inefficient, blah, blah, blah. Okay, so what happens when we have drugs that are selling for $1,000 prescription that would sell for $7 or $8 in a free market? What happens? It's the same graph. It's the same story. I've had economists act like that should go away because we like this. No, that's not the world. If you're not prepared to deal with that, you aren't prepared to have a serious discussion. You're an ideologue. Okay, and I would argue that that's a lot of what's going on, certainly in the pharmaceutical industry. We have rent seeking, and we have very little by way of innovation. Again, getting back to the last points Mariana was making about, how do we understand drugs? How do we understand health? Well, what we care about is health. We don't care about drugs. We want to do things that will make us healthier, live longer. Well, if that's a drug, fine. If it turns out that, we're going to have Pfizer, they'll develop a new drug and that will, improve our quality of life, increase our longevity, wonderful. But what if it turns out that, all the research is pointing to the fact that if we ate more broccoli, we'll keep the bushes away, but, we'll be healthy. Well, we'd want to know that. But, Pfizer's not going to do that research. They have no reason to do that research. And if they happen to find that, well, if they're feeling beneficent, they'd, disclose that and let someone else take off from it. But they might just throw it away because, it's really not going to help them. I was at a conference once and there was someone from the FDA who was recounting this story where one of the drug companies had done a test with them. They're going through the clinical testing process for approval, and it didn't work. And, they had boxes and boxes, all the research, and they had to turn it down. It didn't work. Another drug company came in there, same thing. She's not allowed to tell company B about company A. She said she sent a note to company A and said, will you pass that along? And she didn't tell us what had happened. But, under the law, this is strictly secret. That is not the way for science to advance. Okay, that is not the way for science to advance. We want disclosure. We want the information out there. And again, it would be enormously advantageous economically if drugs, when they were developed, they were available at the market price rather than a patent-protected price. I could go on at great length about that. I'll just mention one other thing in that story. When you allow a company to sell a drug for $1,000 that could be profitably brought to market for $10, gives you a really big incentive to lie. And guess what? Sometimes they do that. And that's not good for our health. And again, that's straight out of your textbook. You'll find it in the trade chapter, not in the drug chapter. But, that's, Econ 101. Just a couple other things, because I go on forever, a lot of good points for us. I just want to say a couple other things. One with finance, yes, finance, the problem with finance is in the economy more generally, but I do like to beat up on finance per se, because it is a waste, and it's an enormous waste. And, I think economists are increasingly recognizing this from good research showing that countries that have very large financial sectors relative to their economy grow less rapidly. Which, the basic story, obviously we need a financial sector. There's a economist at the Bank of International Settlements, Cachetti, has done a couple of papers on this, that when you get economies, their financial sector grows, from very small to somewhat larger, better serves the economy, you have more rapid growth. Then when it goes very large, they have less rapid growth. So the basic story is that you need, obviously, a well-working financial sector to funnel money from savers to investors, classic story. But once it gets very large, it's basically an end in itself. It's draining capital, draining resources from the rest of the country. And having very skilled, sophisticated people who are trying to figure out how they could, get advance word on some trade so they could, move, 1/100th of a second or 1/1,000,000th of a second quicker than Warren Buffett so they can make a fortune. That's not helping the economy. That's basically insider trading. It's a highly technological form of insider trading. That's not a good use of our resources. Okay, the last point, I just want to say a little bit about sort of laying the bedwork, the framework, and well, maybe it will be a bad thing, good thing for the Obama administration. Just a couple of points here. One, we should care a lot about the conditions of competition, and there's something just, it will be, to my mind, an incredible signal of our political sphere, obviously the Obama administration. Do you allow the Comcast-Time Warner merger to go through? I mean, this should be a really vibrant center of technology already. I think the state of competition in our cable sector is pathetic. But if you let that go through, it's not just, their argument doesn't change anything because they already have monopolies. Well, that's true. They largely do have monopolies where they are. But the point is, on the buying side, they have a monopsony. That's absolutely what you do not want to see. So I think that merger, it shouldn't be considered seriously. We'll see what happens. I know they're very powerful companies, so we'll see what happens there. That will say a lot. The last thing, I will say a word of praise for the Obama administration, a big word of praise, actually. Obamacare, you know, there have been all sorts of debates about, you know, the breakout, the website and everything, and obviously lots of problems. But one of the things that, you know, when many of us were talking about the advantages of national health care, obviously we want people to get health insurance, that's first and foremost. But one of the real benefits is you end job lock. And there's a lot of research on this. And, you know, to my view, it's very compelling. You know, I think it's hard to make the result go away. People have health insurance, particularly people have health conditions themselves or in their family. They're reluctant to leave a job that has health insurance. That means you have many fewer people starting businesses. And the research I've seen suggests we're going to see increases on the order of 20 to 25%. People are willing to take the leap because now they know they could still get health care insurance. That's a really big deal. And, you know, again, the Obama people should be going out there advertising that because, you know, to my mind, again, lots of other reasons. That's not the most important reason why you want people to have health insurance, but that is an important one, and they should take credit for it. Thank you.
Dean, thank you. You've thrown a lot out that I'm sure we're going to engage in this. Ellen, you're welcome to stay here. Join us at the podium.
Thank you.
Take a prop with me. My background is as an international trade lawyer, which I've been in for about 4 decades, and that means international competition among countries and industries. And we're here, besides this room being available, I look back and I see Brent Scowcroft Center for International Security, and there is actually a relationship between what we're talking about and both national security, which was his title, not international security, National Security Advisor, and international security, namely the composition of the economy matters. If you look at the Defense Quadrennial Review, occasionally it says GDP went up by X, and that's important, and yes, it is important to be able to fund national security interests, but actually what we have going on within this country matters, and internationally, what we have going on for our common challenges matters a great deal. More people were killed by the influenza than World War I in combat. Now we're cooperating with the Chinese on cancer research, which is very important. We're cooperating with the Poles on clean coal, which has its own issues. But they have a lot of coal, and there's a better way of using it. Most of my work is spent on international agreements, setting the rules for international trade. The important things to me are cross-border data flow, for example, the freedom of it, the internet working. Angela Merkel just met with Mr. Hollande and said, maybe we ought to have all of our servers for all of our information for all of our people only at home. That's not the way the internet works, and it would be stifling. It would be very damaging. So cross-border data flow, which is under discussion both across the Pacific in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Transatlantic Partnership, are extremely important subjects if we got to get the rules right. Protection of intellectual property is extremely important. We're not talking about just length of patent life, which has its issues and has a domestic debate. We're talking about simply counterfeiting and knockoffs, that sort of thing. We're talking about things that create an international environment for innovation. So my career has been, I was very fortunate, came out of the government, U.S. Trade Representative's office, negotiating on things like getting an extra quarter pound of beef per Japanese per year into Japan, and began working with the semiconductor industry, which has some different issues. We were not as good at producing semiconductors as the Japanese were. Fundamental problem, manufacturing technology in the United States lagged. A lot of little companies. The prediction was they would all go out of business. Now, there have been mergers and there have been changes, but actually Intel is still around and a few others are. Government was very important. government came in and co-funded a thing called the SEMITech, the Semiconductor Manufacturing Technology Initiative. $200 million a year, which was money in those days, from the government for 5 years from DARPA, and $200 million a year from the industry. And some of the big players came in, AT&T in those days, and IBM, and Hewlett-Packard, all joined together in pre-competitive R&D. And it wasn't that our chips didn't function. It's simply we had a problem. I remember a presentation by the president of the semiconductor industry, who was then booed, in effect, by his board, who said, the Japanese are doing something terrible. They're dumping quality. They're not just meeting specs, because for a handheld calculator in those days, you didn't need much. But their chips were better, and they could do more than our chips. In other words, it was the opposite of standardization, where you try to get the cheapest thing for substitutable parts in a rifle. It was do the best you possibly can. And actually, technology will flow in that direction and create something better. So it's been an exciting industry to be involved with, and it's become a cooperative industry, so that it's working on energy saving, for example. It's working on reduction of chemicals. There are chemicals that have to be used that are harmful, but it's different if, in terms of quantities used, whether they go into a refrigerator or they go into making a huge number of semiconductors. I was asked to look into the past, and since I work with the National Academies on comparative innovation policy, Abraham Lincoln formed the National Academies. We happened to be fighting a war at the time with ourselves, naturally. The easiest place to start a war is at home. And it had to do with the war effort. He signed the Morrill Act, creating our state public universities through land grants, and the Transcontinental Railway. So we're building infrastructure of various kinds. Education, physical infrastructure, which we sort of, if you cross this country now, you can watch decay. And a lot of our schools are in trouble. And our students are heavily in debt, although that is largely from private institutions, not public. And what we did in the National Academies, the project I chaired was the Comparative Innovation Policy Committee of the Science, Technology, and Economic Policy Board. STEP is interesting. And I see Sujay here from STEP, and Steve Merrill was to be here. Science, technology, and economic policy, the integration of those, and we've had some interesting people chairing our board. For a little while, Larry Summers, and for a long time, Dale Jorgensen at Harvard. And Dale came up with the first study of what's the contribution of information technology to GDP? And he said in the United States, it's about 0.5% of additional GDP a year from IT. It may well be more than that. The World Bank says 2 to 3% for developing countries. When one talks about lifting people out of poverty and giving people an opportunity, I was speaking to an ASEAN forum, and they said, well, what's in it for us? I mean, we know all this IT stuff, protection of intellectual property, cross-border data flow, regulation of state-owned enterprises. That's all sort of, that's good for you folks, you developed countries, but how about us? And the answer is, in part, that you can be in a very small place in a very distant location, and through the internet, you can actually have access to the entire world. And that is a growing phenomenon. The United States has a lot of counterproductive policies. There was an article in the FT a weekend ago about this Indian entrepreneur who was thrilled that his visa was denied to the United States because he built sort of an eBay and distribution system within India. Looking backwards again for a moment, one of the things we did is we went to other countries. We had a very good dialogue with the Germans repeatedly, because there is no country uninterested in innovation in the top 100 or so. Maybe it's all of the countries, but every country, innovation is the watchword. And by innovation, they mean both invention and commercialization. They'd actually like to get some profit out of the end of the stream. And we were at a Fraunhofer, which are public-private partnerships, government-funded, very heavily government-funded, supposedly 1/3 at the federal government level, 1/3 in the lender, the states, and 1/3 from the private sector, but then there's sort of money that goes into the private sector. So it's a lot of government money. And what they try to do is stay on the leading edge of machine tools and high-end automobiles. And they actually have a very low unemployment rate. They do a lot of other things with respect to worker training and a number of other things. But the Germans are actually, they're doing quite well compared with a number of other countries. We were standing there, and I look up at the street sign. It says Gebrüder Wright-Straße. I said, the Wright Brothers Street? Why is this the Wright Brothers Street? And it was because, and they're pointing out wind tunnels from 1908, including one for downdrafts, so sort of a vertical wind tunnel. The Wright brothers came to Germany because there was public money available for testing aircraft at the beginning of the 20th century. It's sort of interesting. Now, fortunately, along came the Army Signal Service and said, we'll buy one of your planes, $25,000, sort of like the Lindbergh story. The Wright brothers did most of their work here. U.S. Mail subsidized the growth of commercial aviation. Looking a little bit forward, DARPA. Why was there DARPA? Because the Soviets put Sputnik up. And this country reacted with the Defense Education Act. We reacted with DARPA. It was a national security-driven notion. And what do we have today? We have GPS. We have weather satellites. We have information processing that wouldn't have existed, which was a collaboration with Bell Labs, with GE, and with MIT. MIT originally a land-grant institution. The purpose of our, and I'll wrap up, the purpose of our work was to talk to other countries, see what they were doing. We put out this tome, which is downloadable for free.
Costs a fortune to print it, though.
Costs a fortune to print it. There may be some here. There are. There are free copies outside for those who rush out and get coffee. You can buy it from the National Academies or from Amazon for slightly less than the National Academies. The title is Rising to the Challenge, U.S. Innovation Policy for the Global Economy. And what we were asked to do by our esteemed reviewers was, couldn't we just have 5 things? 5 things that the United States could do that you want to recommend, because National Academies were supposed to make recommendations to our own government as to what we ought to do. Wouldn't 5 things do it? And actually there's a plethora of, we tried to squeeze them under titles, but there are a lot of things. Our tax system has to be looked at. Our immigration system has to be looked at. The seed capital has to be looked at. There are a whole series of things that have to be looked at. Most other countries are actually looking at us, which is sort of interesting. And we've had a dialogue with the National Development and Reform Commission of China now for several years. And the interesting thing is that dialogue has gotten increasingly honest, because I will start out and I will talk about a great book by Simon Winchester called The Man Who Loved China. Joseph Needham was a scholar at Cambridge who fell in love with a Chinese lady and started writing 28 volumes on scientific discoveries in China. And actually, you know, some millennium ago, the Chinese were were diagnosing diabetes from urine samples. I mean, it's not just paper and gunpowder and that sort of thing, that pasta that came out of China. They were very good, and they lost it someplace along the way. And they're the ones who say they lost it. I tell them all the wonderful things they did, and then they say, but you know, we've got to come back. And they're putting in a lot of money. And sometimes if you put in enough resources, something comes out the other end. There have been failures. Wuhan decided it wanted a semiconductor plant, as did one of the other Western cities. And that didn't work out all that well. It's now owned by a Western company. They're now saying they're going to put $30 billion into semiconductors. They were working towards design, now they want fabs. If you go to upstate New York, you will see at Malta, near Albany, just outside of Albany, a huge fabrication facility for semiconductors. That's a foundry that is funded by Abu Dhabi in part. But why did it go there? Universities were there. Community colleges were there to train workers. And the site was not shovel ready. It was ready. It had the roads. It had the infrastructure, the other forms of physical infrastructure, you know, for effluents, whatever. It had the water supply, and it trained a workforce, and it got the money. And it's a tremendous story of success. If Research Triangle in North Carolina, in 1950, there were just sharecroppers there growing tobacco, and it was in the lowest 10% of GDP in the United States in that area of North Carolina. Now it's in the top part of the GDP per capita in the United States. You can change things dramatically. So summing up, and I should just mention ITRI for 1 second, and that is the Taiwanese. There's a rock, you know, off the coast of China under threat at that time from China, said they wanted to be a semiconductor production center of the world. And so ITRI, their government agency, funded a lot of work, working with the public-private partnership, and they are the top foundries in the world, are in Taiwan. Companies design things here, and they produce them there. They decided they wanted to be the center of laptop manufacture in the world, and they became the center of laptop manufacture. They showed us, I don't know whether it would be practical, but they showed us, they're designing an ATM machine where the buttons are in the air, they're just projected, and you manipulate them. They're just sort of floating there, ethereally, and the good part is money comes out of the machine.
Ethereal money or real money?
Real money. No bitcoins. So
We do need to wrap up so we can get
I
the
am
conversation.
wrapping up.
Okay.
Innovation is not the answer to everything, but it's the answer to a lot of things, and we have a lot of challenges ahead of us. Our gaps in income, we haven't quite figured out. I mean, we do have great innovators in this country, and it's not only the Apple shareholders, but there are a few people at the top of the company who share quite nicely in the profits. We have not solved income distribution. We have not brought about full employment, but innovation is the best tool we have to head in that direction. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So let's have a conversation. How many of you have seen the recent not very good movie RoboCop? Anyone? Anyone brave enough to say you've seen RoboCop? Oh, come on, you've seen RoboCop, right? No? You've not? That is how bad the movie is. I did go see it, and I actually like, you know, brainless movies like that. But the most interesting thing, that relates to this topic is at the beginning of RoboCop, Samuel L. Jackson, or the character he plays, walks out on stage, and there's a national and global debate going on about applying robotics or having basically robot security things, and about the partnerships between government and the private sector, a giant company. And he shows two magazine covers, one of Scientific American and the other magazine being The Atlantic, having this debate. And so when I saw it, I said, we've seen the future, and The Atlantic still exists as a magazine in 2028. Of course, it won't, because you've got so many major technological advances going on. But what was interesting is these questions about, I think that Mariana threw out there about inclusivity, sustainability, and how do you get this right, I think are vital ones. And in thinking about how I would, what would be the big question I think would really matter today. And I think I want to go back to an experience I had where I hosted in the early 2000s a lunch at David Packard's former home in Palo Alto. And it's a great place. If any of you get to go there, they give you a bag of oranges when you leave. They still grow oranges on the property. But we had people like Evan Williams, who then had created the Blogger platform, later was a co-founder of Twitter. We had Sergey Brin and Larry Page. We had Renee James, who's the new probably next CEO to be of Intel. But this was years ago. These were the young, kind of considered next generation leaders who were there. And I think at that time, most of them understood what Mariana has injected in her book and writing, that they understood the government's role both in their own education. They understood what the government's role was in creating some of the opportunities at Stanford and other places. They understood what David Packard meant and how he was a living hybrid of a sort of government versus private sector agenda setting and mission setting, if you will, in Mariana's terms, that Packard was the living embodiment of this. But if you go to the West Coast today, there is such enormous disdain for Washington, enormous disdain for there. They say we don't need DC, that increasingly the roles of government investment in R&D are irrelevant to what we're doing. We are going to end death as a concept. We are creating the technological leaps. And there's become a kind of detachment, if you will, that I've seen, and that I think is quite palpable, of many in the sort of West Coast innovation circuit from what they think the role of government there, even though deep, deep, deep buried in their Cro-Magnon DNA is a role of government. So I want to start there and just ask, are we deluding ourselves here today that when we think about government, the role of government, that we're trying to be like in the Dr. Seuss show, we matter, we're here, but the rest of the innovation ecosystem is really moving beyond us?
I'd say not at all. That attitude, there was a great study done, Krugman wrote it up, I didn't actually read the study, but it looked at lottery winners, and it asked people, who won the lottery, do you think people who, have made a lot of money have, earned it? And compared them to, an appropriate control group, and naturally the lottery winners all thought they had earned it. And I think that's what we have in Silicon Valley, we have people who are very successful, very wealthy, and naturally they want to say, oh, we did it ourselves. I can't say much about their delusions. I'm not a psychologist, but, it's understandable. And, if we want to bring them down to earth, just tell them we're going to stop enforcing their patents, and then they'll see how much they need the government. That's not the real world. It's scary that we have so many people in powerful positions who, have these illusions. And, there's all sorts of illusions that all of us hold, but it's bad news when people in important positions hold such serious illusions about the world.
Alan?
There's been an enormous evolution in at least the semiconductor industry, and I think in the high-tech sector in general in terms of interaction with Washington. The founding generation, although actually they had benefited from government procurement of transistors for military use, put that all aside. And if you read Andy Grove's book, Only the Paranoid Survive, and the U.S. government doesn't get mentioned, it had no role. He discovered that he couldn't make DRAMs profitably, so he decided after 6 months, he said he wasn't very clever at it, but it took him a while to figure out he had to make microprocessors. But actually, there was a lot of public policy going on. But in fact, these folks gather together and they try to work with universities and they try to work with government programs, and they do give prizes. I mean, the Westinghouse Prize is gone. I think it's an Intel Prize now. they care a lot about public policy in a way that they didn't. Now that doesn't mean that they have, like the rest of the country, high respect for the Congress as a general proposition, but and I don't think they spend enough time with the Congress. We had a dinner one night, and there was a senator who was a very bright person who we talked to for an entire dinner, and at the end of the dinner, one of the CEOs said, "That was useless. She knew nothing about our industry." And to me, it was very valuable because she knew nothing about our industry at the beginning of that dinner, and at the end of that dinner, she knew a lot about what was going on and what we needed in terms of public policy. And they don't lobby for money, generally speaking. It's like $15 million a year for focus centers. They don't lobby for money for the industry. They lobby for money for basic science, which is pretty good stuff.
You know, we do have people like Hedrick Smith and others in the audience who've also been thinking for a very long time about this ecosystem of innovation. And again, it's my subjective sense that the various players, the partnerships, the interaction between these various groups has just eroded. That you know, when various senators like Jeff Bingaman, whom you knew well, would go out and say, we're eating our seed corn. We're not making the right kinds of investments in productivity and research and whatnot. And then I'll give you one anecdote, and I would love to get your thoughts about it, where and I haven't been close to this in a while, so I don't know what the trends are today, but there was a point where there was a major initiative to try to get technology out of the national security and national research labs into the hands of small innovators who could then, you know, seed their companies, and then we could basically root in the United States more technologically innovation-based that would create high-wage jobs, and that would propel the sort of innovation profile of the United States in a higher way. And I remember that one of the largest cooperative research and development agreements at that time at Sandia National Labs and Los Alamos was with General Motors. Intel also had one on EUV lithography, for instance. But at that time, we went down to, you know, Jeff Bingaman and I went down to look at the GM CRADA, and we met the GM guys, and all the GM China guys were there. And there was a guy named Kit Green. I don't know if he's here today. He's sort of kicking around still. He hates when I tell this story. Is they had said at the time, our job is to take as much technology as we can out of this lab and pump it into everything that we're deploying in China. And it was just that bluntly said. And I said, you're taking, you know, taxpayers are paying for this. And should there not be some sort of, you know, discussion when you talk about sustainable economics and you talk about inclusivity and you talk about what's an economy for and how do you, you know, balance these different equities? He says, if we don't do this, if we don't, you know, take this technology that we're helping to pay for and drive out of Sandia, we won't be in China in 30 years. And they were very clear that the employment benefits to the United States of what they were doing was sort of about an 8-year net plus and then a 22-year net negative with this. And so I guess my question to you again as the ecosystem is I'm very taken with Mariana's thinking about an entrepreneurial state, just as I was taken by Chalmers Johnson's work on the developmental state in which he founded this. But Chalmers used to tell me, you know, the development state didn't know it was a developmental state. You had to have somebody else to come along. So I'm wondering, has America forgotten that it's an entrepreneurial state and that there's certain elements of this ecosystem that it's just neglected or continued to stop putting together? Alan?
Yeah, my feeling is that you know, we have to continue doing what we're doing, the best parts of it. You know, why isn't there more? In some areas, you look at India.
But is there? I mean,
you look at India, and the part that isn't regulated, Bangalore, software. The part the Indian government didn't get its hands on is doing the best work that's being done in India. But there are the high-level educational institutions that actually turn out the engineers that go into those places. And there's a debate every place about closing down, not sharing. When you say, you know, something gets manufactured in China or the technology shifts to China, it's being as King Canute-like to say, we're not going to do that. We're going to restrict that. There will be a debate. We had a little debate over Smithfield hams. Could the Chinese purchase Smithfield hams? They would get our ham technology, our pig slaughter technology. There have been a lot of, I was called by the Wall Street Journal about a Chinese auto company was buying GM's power steering plant up in Saginaw, Michigan. Was that good? Was it bad? Well, I asked, are they closing the plant, stripping it out, taking the people, and there's nothing left? Or are they continuing the investment, and do they want to be here? What's the story of the kind of investment that's being made? And you can't make a judgment that say Chinese are bad if they come in and buy something like that. We have to stay open, in part because we've become a supply chain global economy. And is it bad that Apple, from a Chinese perspective, they say we're getting, if you see the distribution chart of where the money is, 5% of the price of an apple, or the profits, whichever, and you all are getting everything else, and all we're doing is this assembly stuff. We want to do more than that. Well, they're going to have to go further up the innovation chain to be able to do that. Has to stay open.
Dean?
Yeah, well, I think corporate America is telling us as loudly and as clearly as they can that they're in business as corporations. They have no allegiance to the company, and for us to have policy that sees them any other way is crazy. So if we're doing a policy that's going to make it easy for one of our major tech companies to set up an operation in China, maybe it's good for China. It's no doubt good for the shareholders of that company. It might do absolutely nothing for people in the United States, and we have to recognize that and see it that way. And again, we have to evaluate the policies, what sort of jobs that can create for people here. And if the answer to that is going to be very few per dollar, then that's probably not a good expenditure. But the idea, I won't even bother haranguing them. I just take it for granted. Intel, Apple, they're going to go where it's cheapest. So it's not even worth talking about. If it's cheaper for them to set up in China, they're going to do that. Just take that for granted. And again, if there's Chinese companies that are going to set up a factory here and employ people here and ideally pay them good wages, fine. That's the world we're in. And to not recognize that is just not recognizing reality.
Yeah, with one little response, and that is, somehow a lot of the software engineering of Microsoft is being done on campus, and a lot of the work in Google has been done on campus. Now it's distributed, they're all over the place, but the fact of the matter is that there is something about a cluster, something about the interaction, something about the university system that's there that causes them to want to be there for their most innovative work. So you have to have those, in effect, centers of excellence, those clusters. And we've been pretty good at that. And the rest of the world is trying. But if you go out to, I don't know if Xi'an's the same, but I listened to a pitch from the Xi'an people about 10 years ago, and they had an industrial park. And the one in Pudong is the largest in the world. It is a real estate operation. There is no real interaction. It's not because Fudan University is there, although around Beijing there's biotech stuff that's tied into Xinhua and that sort of thing, Peking University. But the formula isn't there to make it work. It's just real estate.
Let me gather any questions or comments from the audience, but as you do, I want to just sort of rope in, hopefully somebody will do this. When Dean, you laid out the praise and a negative for the Obama administration, Obamacare, and maybe the conditions of competition, I thought you were sort of hitting sort of low level. I thought you would go cosmic. And I guess the cosmic question I have is whether or not, again, coming back to Mariana's book, if Mariana's book is in a way a kind of blueprint for understanding what the elements of an ecosystem could be in a healthy, functioning economy that's going to be pro-innovation and drive, and you're going to really get that. Wasn't 2008, 2009, in which Obama inherited a pretty crappy financial and economic situation, wasn't that the opportunity to fashion in an FDR way a very different kind of blueprint for how an economy works? That rather than resuscitating the financial sector, you should have let the heart attack take place rather than stopping the heart attack. And then use that to make the broader comment that pumping, that even though the pain would be great, that pumping more money into the kind of leverage that Mariana Mazzucato outlines in getting the productivity engine back in place. Don't answer me yet, because I'm going to get a couple questions. Hedrick Smith is going to make but I do want you to answer me in the line of responding to others. But Hedrick?
I just wonder if we could ask Mariana a question.
Well,
Excuse
yeah.
me. I wonder if we could ask Mariana a question. I'm not quite clear what the ground rules are. You talked about definancializing the real economy, which strikes me as a very good idea. And I just wonder if you'd talk about that a bit further and explain what that involves, how you disentangle the octopus-like hands of the financial sector around the real economy,
Okay, so
and
we've
what
got-
that would
yeah.
do for innovation and production.
We've got that. I'm going to take a couple of other questions, and then we can all answer it in there. Yes, sir, right here.
Thank you. I have a question for all of the panelists, and it concerns industrial policy. Thank you. I'm Jess Wilhelm. I have a degree in science and trying to work in policy in Washington, D.C. And my question relates to this. Essentially, in order to have industrial policy, we need a bureaucracy that is active and engaged in industry technology. And I think we don't have that currently. So what is the best way to develop an industrial policy that's supported by an active bureaucracy?
Got it. And then this gentleman right here, and then we'll take the final, and then we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
Philip Weber, Congressional Budget Office. My question is, Mariana said that very nice statement about for every internet you have a Concord. How, given that the government does not have the negative feedback system that the market provides companies, at a certain point they do go bankrupt, how do you figure out when you're chasing down a rat hole like synthetic rubber versus how do you figure out that you're just taking the appropriate VC losses that going to be a lot of bad investments for one great one?
Great. Thank you. Great question. And then this gentleman, and then we'll go back to a round robin right here. Yes.
I'm Marco Di Capo. I'm the former science counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing and Minister Counselor of Scientific Affairs at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi. I have a question for Alan Wolff, and this is, two arguments that you made. Number one was that there was a growth in Bangalore that took place outside of government regulation. And number two, that the innovators in Silicon Valley do not need Washington. The question that I have for you, is there sufficient dynamism in the legal environment that can keep up with the pace of innovation?
Great question. Mariana, why don't you just join us up here at the podium? Or chair.
We could be more innovative.
Do we have a few extra minutes that we can? The problem is really the microphone, I think. So. Yeah.
You can just.
Well, here we've got a microphone here for you. Great. So let's go through and let's answer the questions collectively. But why don't we start out with the definancialization?
So I want to answer that in relation to the last question you posed then, because I think that in order to change this ridiculous discourse right now in Silicon Valley, like there's this secessionist movement. I don't know if you've heard about it, right? Peter Thiel, one of the PayPal guys, is helping these Silicon Valley guys go offshore, right? Because they really think that the government's completely impeding their innovation. In order to change that, we actually have to question the fundamentals, which comes down to the whole shareholder. Well, it comes down to also corporate governance. Now, it's not just about saying, oh, share buybacks are bad. It's what is the justification for that? The justification for that is a particular theory called shareholder value theory, which actually comes down to things about innovation. So what legitimizes that approach is this idea that everyone has this sort of guaranteed rate of return, right? So workers, they have a salary, the company has to pay back a loan, so the bank has some sort of guaranteed interest rate. The only ones that are the real risk takers, okay, who have no guaranteed rate of return, they're the residual claimants, this is what the theory says, since 1980, which has completely revolutionized the way that US companies are set up, or their shareholders. Okay, so the first thing to say is, the government had a guaranteed rate of return when it invested in the internet, or when it invested most recently in Tesla Motors, $500 million guaranteed loan? No. So that theory is just completely wrong. Okay? So until we don't actually demolish that theory of value, Okay, then all these critiques, which are about value extraction, which everyone seems to be talking about, rent seekers, speculators, everyone is sort of making that critique of what caused the financial crisis, without, however, questioning the theory of value underneath it, then those critiques have no effect. In fact, everything's getting worse. Executive pay, all the different indicators that people look at when they talk about value extraction are just getting worse. So the first thing to do is to just completely, if you want, de-encroach ourselves, coming back to Keynes' quote that I was talking to someone before, where he says, practical men who think they're completely apolitical are actually, slaves of a defunct economist. We are today completely slaves of the shareholder value idea. And it's not just about them critiquing the share buybacks. And so what the government should do in terms of policy is also not be completely captured by these ideas of who the risk takers are, which also, by the way, and this is so important, because innovation, as someone who's studied innovation a lot, the first thing to say is, well, what do we know about innovation? Innovation is not a white noise Gaussian process, okay? It is cumulative. It is path dependent. So think of it, again, coming to my little non-existent graphs, as a cumulative distribution curve, right? There's a whole integral under that curve. If you come in late, like VC came in 20 years after the government did all this stuff for biotech, came in after nanotech. Today, it's completely coming after the big stuff is done by government. If you come in late, but policymakers then you are able to capture the entire integral under that curve. So it's not to say VC guys are bad and state is good. It's to say that there's a complete disproportion between what we're allowing to be taken out of that booty, if you want, the integral under that curve, and what these guys have actually put in. And that means actually understanding how innovation works. It's not just about having innovation policy, ecosystems, all that trendy talk. It's about actually understanding what's under that curve and who contributed to it. So the government should be much more confident. And of course, not just throw money at life sciences with these companies that are doing all these share buybacks, actually have a thing where they can only receive the benefits, both in terms of the tax incentives, but also the benefits of the funding, if they show that they're going to reinvest their profits into the production process and not just extract it.
Great, thank you. Banny,
Well, I just said, you don't just have innovation policy, which today we have both in the UK and the US, all this life sciences strategy. Forget it. You don't just help, Pfizer and Glaxo and give them even more money. You say you will only get these different types of benefits, including all the new patent tax policies, if they will change the degree to which they are, reinvesting their money, mega profits, which are not falling, they're still the top on the Fortune 500 profit margins, into the production process. There's not that conversation. We are not confident enough to say—
leveraging into the investment of into the innovation.
Yeah, we don't have a confident government that says that we want a particular type of business. That's, it's not to say we pick a business, the whole picking winners thing, but we should pick what kind of businesses do we think will, in fact, create job creation in this country. But even if, I'm not into the whole nationalistic thing because, as you say, there will also be investment back in here if we have these policies. But you have to have an innovation policy which is structured around what kind of businesses do we think will actually be producing, high productivity and high job growth. And so you should not allow these different types of tax policies and innovation policies in terms of direct benefits to companies that will not show that they, that have a record of the last 10 years of just putting money into value extraction as opposed to value creation.
Banny, we got 4 or 5 more minutes. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, let's try to wrap up by 11.
Okay, great. So, gentlemen, we've got 4 great lines. One, how do you know when you're not going down a rabbit hole? Can Washington keep up innovation with what's going on the outside? Do you need to basically train an apparatus of bureaucrats to understand fundamentally that there is a process of picking winners and losers? And then finally, my question is, did Obama miss his chance to become the champion of the entrepreneurial state? Alan?
Yes and no on the last question. Namely, having the heart attack would not have been a good thing. So as far as we went was vital. Did we go far? Did he go far enough? Not at all. Secondly, we have a democracy. We don't have a lot of Jeff Binghamans. If we're going to have more Jeff Binghamans, people who understand what creates innovation and how to create good public policies, then Mariana actually moves to Washington and becomes a full-time lobbyist. Because actually the pharma and the drug companies are here, and the oil companies are here. There are a lot of people here, and it's the way our system works. And it's not a bad system. It is, you come here and you make your case. And the people in this room are generally not spending, many of them, most of them I think probably, their time on Capitol Hill trying to get their congressperson and say, this is what's necessary, not just agricultural supports. By the way, I talked a little bit about transborder data flow and all the wonderful subjects in TPP. What's holding it up is dairy, poultry, sugar, the textiles. Cotton. It is the basic things that governments find it hardest to do, hardest to move on. And why? Because the sugar lobby will pay a certain amount of money to attend a lot of fundraisers all year long. And we've got to, it's going to be a tough thing to do to overcome the sort of the 19th century issues to get to the 21st century issues. We're not even in the 20th century issues.
Did Obama fail by not thinking big? Yeah. You know, we had an incredible opportunity, and or he had an incredible opportunity, perhaps I should say. And, you know, he was determined to think small, and it was a real tragedy. And, you know, I'm going to say something as clear as I possibly can, because I've always said this, and people go, oh, you don't really mean this. We had no risk of a second Great Depression. That was a bogeyman that they created so that they could all pat themselves on the back, say, at least we didn't have a second Great Depression, setting an all-time new low bar. You know, and I always say to people, tell me what you mean. And I've never heard anyone give me a coherent story. You know, yes, we might have had more of a financial collapse. Can anyone tell me what would have condemned us to 10 years of double-digit unemployment? We're not morons. We learned from Keynes, and many people knew it before Keynes, how you could get an economy off the ground. There was nothing that would have condemned us to 10 years of double-digit unemployment. That was simply a bogeyman so they could say, oh, you know, at least we didn't get a second Great Depression. Now, in terms of what we could have done, again, thinking back to energy policy, I think is great. You know, so the issue here is we want to reduce our emissions of greenhouse gases. Part of that was, you know, some of the things that they did, backing, you know, solar power, electric cars, that's great. Okay, how about, you know, one of the ways we use up a lot of greenhouse gases is transportation. Suppose we could encourage companies to have 4-day work weeks rather than 5. Did anyone even think about that? You know, to laugh, you know, but beyond that, no. How about having free buses? I mean, you know, okay, people don't like buses. I don't give a damn. I like buses. I take them. You know, so you have free buses and bus lanes, you know, so you have lanes exclusive to buses. You get on the bus, you don't have to dig for your fare. Be very quick. The people who don't like buses, they're welcome to sit in traffic jams in their SUV. The rest of us will go into work very quickly. But these are sorts of things, that doesn't even cost a lot of money, you know, but not even on the agenda. So, yeah, I mean, it was an enormous lost opportunity. And, you know, let's say we didn't have the second Great Depression, but just, you know, the industrial policy, I guess I'm less concerned about that in this country just because there's such a negative attitude. I think the key here is transparency. You look at how many times we're going to hear about, we have heard about Solyndra. You know, so obviously, you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, obviously, if a government bureaucracy, they want to keep it going, everything's fine, or, you know, I understand that. Of course, it's going to happen. But at the same time, as long as, you know, the numbers are all available to the public, I don't think we have to worry about a shortage of people that'll be out there yelling, hey, this is a boondoggle. And, you know, are we going to get exactly right? No, but we're never going to get exactly right. The private sector doesn't get exactly right. So I think the risk of us, you know, having this huge, you know, industry that's going nowhere and we're sinking tens or hundreds of billions, I just don't think that's very plausible. Mariana?
But just about this question of bureaucracy that I think no one's really touched on, I think that the impact of outsourcing within government, it's huge in terms of retaining intelligence, you know, an intelligent, smart, dynamic bureaucracy. And I see this in the UK too. I mean, the BBC, which is, you know, part of the state apparatus, made a radical decision not to outsource the investments that were needed to create what's now one of the most innovative internet platforms for broadcasting, the iPlayer, which you can't get here because you don't pay the BBC canon fee, whatever it's called. And so, and that was fascinating. I mean, their high market share is very much a result of actually reinvesting into their particular institution where they, you know, attract geeks within the public sector. And another awesome example, and I think these examples have to be told, government digital services, you know, because of the crisis that's just happened with Obamacare here, with government's digital capacity. In the UK, wanted to do a website. They said, you know, it's crazy that you have to go to Google to find a white paper of, say, the Ministry of Business, what's called BIS there. We should have our own website. So what did? They outsourced it. To who? To Serco, by the way, who is responsible now for Obama's insurance program, I found out. Very problematic company, which is under attack for all sorts of scandals. But anyway, Serco did it, charged government an arm and a leg, huge amount of money, I think it was 25 million, to create a crap, very static website. And someone who was in the BBC was like, why did they do that? So people in GDS said, let's restart. Let's bring in to government digital services the top people from the iPlayer. Let's make an announcement, get the geeks within GDS. And they created a website that's just won the most important design prize in the world. And it's costing government 1/10 of what Serco charged it. And at the same time, it's created this dynamic bureaucracy, right? But outsourcing is a massive problem. Some things like catering, I don't think it's a huge problem, but that's not what's really being outsourced. The IT, the intelligence is being outsourced. So government's losing what we call within business studies, its absorptive capacity. And it's actually a tragedy. And I think all this stuff will be impossible unless you have a smart public sector which reinvests within itself. So you're not just helping innovators, you are yourself becoming innovative.
Let me just in closing up, just make one. There's been a wonderful discussion, but one thing I think would be interesting. I think that the work of the Scowcroft Center in this area is so important. It's hard for me to imagine more important topics than this when you look at forward-leaning. How do you get bets right? How do you get the economic ecosystem right? What's happening around the world? And I think this feedback issue is a really important one, actually. And I also think the people that are, tasked, you have the sort of infrastructure of awareness. But one element that may be missing today, which is interesting, while it's not DARPA, and ARPA-E just had a fabulous, huge conference, which is, just stunning. And I think that the big strategic leaps are likely to be ones where universities, federal government, and other there. But if you go talk, I spent a lot of time recently with Mike Bloomberg and Rahm Emanuel, both of whom are huge advocates of trying to transition people who are not familiar with data management, to look at alternative models and methods, look at way you can basically change the game inside the spheres they control to create a more innovative base and to kind of get their parts of the policy equation right. You talk to state governors. And so there's an enormous amount of folks that are focusing on this feedback thing, but what is their role within the innovation sector? And they are not waiting for Washington to set the pace on all this. So there's a dimension at the state and city level which is extremely dynamic and creative. That may be another way to kind of follow on. But I want to thank Mariana Mazzucato for inspiring this conversation, and Alan Wolff and Dean Baker for helping to fill it out, and for others, Hedrick Smith, and all of you for being here. So thank you. Thank you. You guys are in charge. So great. There'll be a coffee break and then a next panel. Excellent. Thank you. Wonderful.